it's Olivia. Welcome back to your endocrinology chapter. In this section, we'll be going over type 1 and type 2 diabetes, as well as the general pathophysiology of insulin deficiency or resistance, which are super high yield topics for step 1. So let's get started. First, let's just talk about what insulin does in basic physiology. Insulin is responding to a fed state, so you are going to be in a high energy state, and that is why insulin is going to act as an anabolic hormone. When you have a bunch of excess energy, it's going to be a good time for your body to focus on building other tissues. So when you have increased insulin reflecting increased glucose in your bloodstream, then you are going to stimulate glycogenesis, so you have extra energy, so you would like to store this energy in the form of glycogen. Increased lipogenesis, again, you have extra energy, so you would like to store this energy in the form of fats, and then decrease gluconeogenesis. If you have enough glucose already, enough that you're already going to be building it into fats and into glycogen, then it doesn't really make sense that you would want to be making more glucose at this point, and that's why insulin is going to decrease gluconeogenesis. All of this is also going to lead to increased cell growth and differentiation as part of that anabolic process where we are building new tissues. So that's what happens when you have increased levels of insulin in normal physiology. But what happens when you have decreased levels of insulin? Well, decreased levels of insulin are going to lead to the exact opposite of what we just talked about, right? So instead of increased glycogenesis, you're going to have increased glycogenolysis, which will be the breaking down of glycogen to release more glucose into your system. Remember, when you have low levels of insulin in your system, this is usually reflecting a starvation state or an energy poor state, so you're going to be trying to get glucose from other sources. You can achieve this through glycogenolysis, breaking down your glycogen stores, releasing more glucose into the bloodstream, increased lipolysis. So instead of building fat stores, you're now going to be breaking them down to release more of that glucose. Increased gluconeogenesis, since you don't have glucose lying around, you're going to be trying to create that. And all of these can be normal physiologic responses to just a low energy or low glucose state in the body. However, in the case of diabetes, you're not having decreased insulin because you don't have enough glucose. In the case of diabetes, you are either having decreased insulin because you have insulin deficiency, which is more usual in the case of type 1 diabetes, or insulin insensitivity, more usual in the case of type 2 diabetes. And looking over here on our diagram, let's walk through some of the general physiologic changes when you see either insulin deficiency or insensitivity and you still have high levels of glucose in the body, like in type 1 or type 2 diabetes. So as we previously discussed, when you have decreased levels of insulin, or you just have insulin insensitivity at these receptors, this is going to lead to your body thinking that it's in a low energy or starvation state. This means that you're going to be breaking down other tissues to try to release more glucose, release more energy into the body. You might see proteolysis, so the breaking down of proteins, which will become amino acids, which can then go through gluconeogenesis to release more glucose. You might see decreased glucose uptake into cells. Remember, insulin is responsible for a lot of that glucose uptake into cells through your GLUT4 channels especially, so that will be decreased in the setting of low insulin or insulin insensitivity. Increased glycogenolysis, we talked about breaking down our glycogen stores to release more glucose. Increased gluconeogenesis, so you're making more glucose because your body thinks you don't have it. And then increased lipolysis, so you're breaking down your fat stores to release more glycerol, which can then go through gluconeogenesis and again release more glucose. And as I said before, in normal physiology, when you are not releasing insulin because you actually don't have glucose lying around, this is an appropriate response. If your body actually didn't have glucose, it would need to go through glycogenolysis and gluconeogenesis and all these other pathways to ensure that you had enough energy since you weren't consuming glucose. So you'd have to release more glucose into the bloodstream. However, in the case of diabetes, it's not the issue that you don't have enough glucose. You actually do, and you may have an abundance of glucose in your bloodstream. However, because you're unable to either make insulin or your body isn't listening to the insulin, you are still going to have all of these pathways ramped up to make more and more glucose, and that is what is going to lead to the hyperglycemia in type 1 and type 2 diabetes. And the downstream effects of this hyperglycemia is what is going to cause a lot of the presentation symptoms of diabetes. So when you have hyperglycemia, I think the first thing that's important to remember is this is going to lead to an increased plasma osmolarity. So there's more particles floating in your blood, and that is what leads to the increased plasma osmolarity. This will lead to increased thirst. So patients with diabetes may say, oh, I've been really thirsty over the past couple of weeks, just can't get enough water. Additionally, hyperglycemia also leads to polyuria. So through osmotic diuresis, because there's so many more particles of glucose in your blood, when you're filtering that in your kidneys into urine, it's going to be pulling out more water and pulling out more salt. So So hyperglycemia leads to increased thirst in addition to polyuria and increased losses of salt and water. This can lead to, of course, dehydration and hypovolemia, and downstream effects of that are decreased circulation, and this could even lead to decreased tissue perfusion and organ damage. In the most severe cases, this might even lead to coma or death. And the increased urination, the polyuria, the dehydration and hypovolemia and the sequela of that, and the increased thirst can be seen in type 1 or type 2 diabetes. The next pathway we'll talk about is a little bit more specific to type 1 diabetes, and this is the increased breakdown of fats leading to an increase in plasma-free fatty acids. Plasma-free fatty acids are metabolized and can cause ketoacidosis, vomiting, a fruity odor to your breath, all these things. Also leads to an anion gap metabolic acidosis. And this is going to be very classic of DKA, or diabetic ketoacidosis, seen in type 1 diabetes. So this anion gap metabolic acidosis can lead to hyperventilation, or what we call Kussmaul breathing, as your body is trying to compensate for the acidosis by breathing off more CO2. It's a very rapid, deep breathing. Additionally, this anion gap metabolic acidosis can be exacerbated when we have the dehydration and the hypovolemia that we already talked about, leading to decreased tissue perfusion, tissue damage, and a rising serum lactate. That can also contribute to this anion gap metabolic acidosis. So as I said, more commonly seen in type 1 diabetes, and I would like you to associate type 1 diabetes with ketoacidosis, but an important pathway to be aware of the physiology as well. So to quickly recap what we went through in this pathway, what I want you to remember about whether you have insulin deficiency or insensitivity is that the end result of this insulin deficiency, this insulin insensitivity, tricking your body into thinking that it's in a low energy state, even though you do have an abundance of glucose, is hyperglycemia, which leads to increased thirst, dehydration, decreased tissue perfusion, and more in the case of type 1 diabetes, anion gap metabolic acidosis. The reason that we see these results is the hyperglycemia leads to glycosuria, so you are urinating out some of this excess glucose in the urine, and that is also going to be pulling in more water. This increase in plasma osmolality also leads to the increase in thirst. The hyperglycemia can also lead to polyuria, as we just discussed, and that polyuria, as you're losing salt and water, can lead to dehydration and decreased tissue perfusion. It's this decreased tissue perfusion that causes the increase in lactic acid. So we often talk about in anaerobic exercise, when your tissue is not getting enough oxygen, that can lead to the buildup in lactic acid, and that's why your muscles feel sore. This decrease in tissue perfusion is what's leading to the decreased oxygenation of those tissues. That is what is causing the lactic acidosis, which here is also contributing to our anion gap metabolic acidosis. The increased lipolysis can lead to increased free fatty acid release, which will cause the ketogenesis, and finally the anion gap metabolic acidosis. So this is a basic overview of the pathophysiology of insulin deficiency or resistance. I think it will come in really useful when we discuss diabetes mellitus type 1 and type 2 in our next video, and I'll see you next time.